The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Meridian as Captain Sarah Chun stepped from the transport vehicle, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The base stretched before her like a small city, with identical barracks buildings lined in perfect rows and the distant sound of drill sergeants shouting cadence. To any observer, she appeared to be just another officer reporting for routine assignment. They had no idea she carried credentials from the Pentagon Inspector General's office. Chun adjusted her uniform jacket, feeling the weight of her Bronze Star and Combat Action ribbon against her chest. 2 deployments in Afghanistan had earned her those decorations, along with scars most people never saw. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now investigated the very institution she'd served with distinction for 8 years. Her orders were classified, buried within a standard personnel transfer that identified her as a logistics coordinator. In reality, she was here to document what Pentagon intelligence suggested was systematic abuse in Fort Meridian's training programs. The first thing she noticed was the sound. Even from the administrative parking lot, she could hear the unmistakable bellow of someone screaming at recruits. The voice carried across the parade ground with practiced fury, each word designed to strip away dignity. Chun had experienced plenty of aggressive drill instructors during her own training, but this felt different. There was a personal cruelty in the tone that made her skin crawl. I wonder if any of you have served in the military or have family members who've experienced military training. The culture can be intense, but it's supposed to build character, not destroy it. What state are you watching from tonight? Chun made her way toward the administration building, passing groups of young recruits who moved with the nervous energy of people constantly expecting punishment. Their eyes darted toward any approaching authority figure, ready to snap to attention at a moment's notice. She'd seen that look before, but usually in combat zones where hypervigilance kept you alive. Here, it suggested something was fundamentally wrong with the training environment. Inside the administration building, the duty sergeant directed her to the personnel office where she would officially check in. The hallway was lined with photographs of distinguished graduates, their faces proud and confident in their dress uniforms. Chun wondered how many of them would approve of what their alma mater had apparently become under current leadership. Colonel Marcus Brennan's reputation had preceded her arrival. Pentagon briefings described him as a decorated infantry officer who'd received command of Fort Meridian's training battalion 18 months ago. Since then, formal complaints had increased by 300%, though most were dismissed as routine training stress. What concerned the Inspector General was the pattern emerging from those complaints. Female recruits reported disproportionate harassment. Experienced personnel faced retaliation for questioning methods, and several promising military careers had ended abruptly after clashing with Brennan's approach. The personnel clerk, a nervous corporal named Williams, processed her paperwork with shaking hands. When Chun asked about reporting to her new commanding officer, Williams' face went pale. He explained that Colonel Brennan was currently conducting afternoon training exercises and suggested she wait until tomorrow for the formal introduction. The young man's fear was palpable, radiating through his stammered responses and averted eyes. Chun decided not to wait. She needed to observe Brennan in action to see firsthand what had generated so many complaints. Following the sound of shouting, she made her way to Training Field Alpha, where approximately 40 recruits stood in formation under the blazing afternoon sun. At the center of the chaos stood a tall man with graying temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Colonel Brennan was magnificent in his fury, stalking between the rows of recruits like a predator selecting prey. His voice carried the practiced intimidation of someone who enjoyed wielding power over those who couldn't fight back. Chun positioned herself at the edge of the field, officially observing but mentally documenting every violation of proper training protocol she witnessed. When Brennan spotted her, his expression shifted from mild curiosity to dismissive contempt. He approached with the swagger of someone unused to being questioned, his eyes taking in her rank insignia and ribbon rack with obvious calculation. Chun could see him categorizing her as another Pentagon desk officer, someone who'd probably never seen real combat, despite the decorations on her chest. Their first exchange was brief, but telling. Brennan introduced himself with perfunctory courtesy, while his eyes communicated clear disdain for what he assumed was her administrative background. When Chen mentioned her logistics assignment, she watched him mentally dismiss her as irrelevant to his training mission. He had no idea that her real purpose was documenting exactly the kind of behavior he'd just displayed. As Brennan returned to terrorizing his recruits, Chen began taking mental notes that would eventually become formal reports. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly while she observed training methods that crossed the line from demanding to abusive. By the time evening formation concluded, she had witnessed enough regulation violations to justify immediate intervention. But her orders were clear: gather comprehensive evidence before taking action. Walking back to her assigned quarters, Chen reflected on the day's observations. Fort Meridian had the infrastructure of excellence, but the leadership of tyranny. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to document the scope of the problem, but tonight she would compile her initial findings into the first of many reports that would eventually reach the highest levels of military command. She had no way of knowing that her investigation would soon become very personal, or that Colonel Brennan's abuse would escalate far beyond what even the Pentagon suspected was possible. Chen spent her first full day at Fort Meridian buried in personnel files, officially reviewing logistics protocols while secretly analyzing complaint patterns that painted a disturbing picture. The base library's records room provided perfect cover for her investigation, allowing her to access disciplinary files under the pretense of understanding supply chain disruptions. What she discovered exceeded even Pentagon expectations for institutional dysfunction. 15 formal complaints against Colonel Brennan had been filed in the past 8 months, each one documenting increasingly aggressive behavior toward female personnel. The complaints shared common elements that suggested systematic targeting rather than isolated incidents. Brennan's preferred method involved public humiliation disguised as uniform inspections, where he would find microscopic infractions to justify extended verbal assault. Several complainants described his obsession with military decorations, claiming female soldiers hadn't earned the right to wear their ribbons and badges. The most detailed complaint came from Sergeant First Class Maria Martinez, a logistics specialist with 6 years of exemplary service. Her statement described Brennan's badge inspection ritual in clinical detail. He would approach female soldiers during formation, examine their ribbon rack with exaggerated scrutiny, then loudly question their right to wear specific decorations. Martinez described how he grabbed her shoulder while screaming about combat action ribbon standards in front of her entire unit, demanding she explain exactly how she'd earned the right to wear it. Chun cross-referenced Martinez's account with medical records and found a pattern of stress-related illnesses among Brennan's targets. 3 female soldiers had requested transfers to other bases, citing family emergencies that investigation revealed were fabricated to escape hostile work environment. 2 promising NCOs had simply resigned from military service rather than continue serving under Brennan's command. The human cost of his leadership style was measurable in lost talent and broken careers. By afternoon, Chun had documented enough evidence to justify immediate investigation, but her orders required comprehensive documentation before action. She needed to witness Brennan's methods firsthand and gather testimony from current personnel who might be afraid to file formal complaints. The challenge was maintaining her cover while conducting interviews that could expose her true mission. Her opportunity came when she observed afternoon training exercises on Field Beta. Brennan had assembled 30 female recruits for what he announced as remedial uniform instruction. Chun positioned herself near the ammunition storage building where she could observe without drawing attention. What she witnessed went far beyond aggressive training into deliberate psychological abuse. Brennan selected Private Johnson, a 19-year-old recruit from Ohio whose only visible flaw was a slightly crooked name tag. He ordered her to the center of the formation, where he began a systematic deconstruction of her appearance, her heritage, and her right to wear the uniform. His voice carried across the field with practiced cruelty as he questioned whether someone from her background understood military standards. The other recruits stood frozen while their teammate endured public humiliation designed to break her spirit. The colonel's obsession with military decorations became clear when he noticed Johnson's ribbons were positioned 1 millimeter too high on her uniform jacket. He used this microscopic violation to justify a 10-minute lecture about earning the right to wear military honors, his voice rising to a roar as he demanded she remove every decoration until she could prove she deserved them. Chen watched Johnson's hands shake as she unpinned ribbons she'd earned through legitimate military training, her face burning with shame while Brennan smiled with satisfaction. When training concluded, Chen approached Martinez privately in the dining facility. The sergeant's initial wariness gave way to desperate relief when Chen explained her true mission. Martinez had been afraid to pursue her complaint further after witnessing what happened to others who challenged Brennan's methods. She described a culture of fear where speaking out guaranteed retaliation, transfer to undesirable assignments, or negative performance evaluations that could end military careers. Martinez revealed that Brennan's abuse extended beyond public humiliation into financial misconduct. She'd noticed irregularities in equipment requisitions, with expensive items disappearing from inventory without proper documentation. Several soldiers suspected Brennan was selling military property through outside contacts, but proving it required access to records he controlled. The sergeant agreed to help Chun gather evidence, understanding that outside intervention was their only hope for justice. Evening brought Chen's first direct confrontation with Brennan during dinner at the officers' club. He approached her table with calculated casualness, making comments about desk officers who didn't understand real military training. His tone carried subtle threat beneath surface politeness as he questioned her background and assignment. Chun maintained her logistics cover while internally noting his attempt to intimidate a superior officer through psychological pressure. Brennan's parting comment revealed his growing suspicion about her presence. He suggested that Fort Meridian's training methods might seem harsh to someone with limited field experience, implying that her decorations didn't reflect genuine combat leadership. Chun recognized the same pattern he used against his other targets, the systematic undermining of credentials designed to justify future abuse. She was no longer just documenting his methods, but becoming his next victim. Back in her quarters, Chun compiled the day's findings into encrypted reports that would reach Pentagon analysts within hours. The scope of Brennan's misconduct extended far beyond aggressive training into criminal territory that demanded immediate intervention. But her investigation had also painted a target on her back, making her the focus of attention from someone who specialized in destroying military careers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she balanced maintaining cover with gathering evidence against an increasingly suspicious adversary. The weight of her mission pressed down as she prepared for sleep. 15 complaint files represented 15 broken careers, but they were only the documented cases. How many others had suffered in silence, afraid to challenge a system that protected abusers while punishing victims? Chen's investigation would either expose the truth or make her another casualty of institutional indifference. Time would determine which outcome awaited her at Fort Meridian. The morning formation assembled under gray skies that matched Chen's growing apprehension about Brennan's intentions. 200 personnel stood in perfect ranks across the parade ground, their breath visible in the crisp air as they awaited the daily briefing. Chen took her position among the company officers, unaware that she was about to become the centerpiece of Brennan's most brazen display of abuse yet witnessed at Fort Meridian. Brennan emerged from the administration building with the deliberate stride of someone who had planned every detail of the coming confrontation. His eyes swept across the formation before settling on Chan with unmistakable intent. She recognized the predatory focus from her observations of his previous victims, the calculated selection of target followed by systematic destruction. What she hadn't anticipated was his willingness to attack a fellow officer in front of the entire company. The colonel began with routine announcements about training schedules and base maintenance, his voice carrying across the parade ground with practiced authority. Chen noticed several enlisted personnel glancing nervously in her direction, as if they sensed what was approaching but felt powerless to prevent it. The tension built slowly as Brennan concluded his standard briefing and announced an immediate uniform inspection for all personnel. What followed violated every principle of military leadership Chun had learned during 8 years of service. Brennan approached her position with exaggerated ceremony, making it clear to every witness that she was his intended target. His voice carried across the silent formation as he announced that certain officers needed remedial instruction in proper uniform standards, implying that her appearance required correction before junior personnel. The first attack focused on her combat action ribbon, the decoration she'd earned during her second deployment to Afghanistan. Brennan examined the ribbon with theatrical scrutiny before loudly questioning its positioning on her uniform jacket. According to him, the ribbon was mounted 2 millimeters too high, violating regulations he claimed to have memorized during his 20-year career. Chen knew her uniform was impeccable, but Brennan's accusations weren't about actual violations. His voice rose to carry across the entire formation as he demanded she explain exactly how she'd earned the right to wear combat decorations. The question was designed to humiliate, suggesting that her ribbons were undeserved while forcing her to justify her service record in front of 200 witnesses. Chun maintained military bearing while internally documenting this blatant abuse of authority for her investigation files. Brennan's hands moved to her Bronze Star, the decoration that represented her most significant act of courage under fire. He claimed the ribbon's angle was incorrect and demanded she remove it immediately for inspection. When Chun hesitated, citing proper protocol for decoration handling, Brennan's facade of professional concern dropped completely. His face flushed with rage as he accused her of insubordination for questioning his authority during formation. The physical badge removal began with her combat action ribbon. Brennan tore the decoration from her uniform jacket with unnecessary force, the metal clasp scraping against fabric as he held it up for the formation to see. His commentary continued throughout the process, describing how some officers received decorations through politics rather than merit, his words clearly directed at Chun, while the entire company watched in stunned silence. Her Bronze Star followed, ripped from her chest with deliberate violence that sent the ribbon flying across the parade ground. Brennan's satisfaction was visible as he stripped away the symbol of her courage under fire, reducing 8 years of distinguished service to scattered metal and fabric. The formation remained frozen in place, 200 witnesses to institutional abuse that violated every principle of military justice. The systematic destruction continued with her Overseas Service Ribbon, her National Defense Ribbon, and finally her Army Achievement Medal. Each removal was accompanied by commentary about officers who didn't understand military standards, who received assignments they hadn't earned, who needed education and proper respect for military traditions. Chun stood motionless throughout the assault, her training preventing any response that could be construed as insubordination. When the last ribbon hit the ground, Brennan stepped back to address the formation about maintaining proper standards. His speech about military excellence rang hollow, while Chun stood before 200 personnel with her uniform jacket scarred by torn fabric and missing decorations. The colonel's message was clear to every witness: challenge his authority and face public destruction regardless of rank or service record. The formation dispersed in uncomfortable silence, leaving Chin alone on the parade ground surrounded by scattered ribbons that represented years of distinguished service. She bent to collect the decorations with mechanical precision, her mind already calculating how this escalation would feature in her reports to Pentagon investigators. Brennan had just provided documented evidence of abuse that would be impossible to dismiss or rationalize. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached cautiously as Chun gathered the last of her ribbons, his face showing the mixture of rage and helplessness shared by every witness to institutional injustice. He offered quiet words of support while helping collect pieces of torn fabric from her Bronze Star ribbon. His whispered promise to document everything he'd seen confirmed that Brennan's abuse had finally gone too far for even frightened personnel to ignore. Lieutenant Vale materialized beside them moments later, her expression conveying barely controlled fury at what she'd witnessed. As the company's administrative officer, she understood the regulations Brennan had violated during his public assault on a superior officer. Her offer to provide formal testimony indicated that Chen's investigation had gained crucial allies willing to risk retaliation for justice. Walking back to her quarters with damaged decorations clutched in her hands, Chen realized that Brennan's escalation had fundamentally changed her mission. She was no longer just documenting abuse, but had become its most visible victim, her public humiliation serving as warning to anyone who might challenge his authority. The colonel had made a critical error by attacking someone with both the credentials and connections necessary to ensure accountability. The torn ribbons in her hands represented more than personal assault. They symbolized institutional failure that demanded immediate correction. Chen's encrypted report that evening would trigger responses from the highest levels of military command, setting in motion events that would ultimately destroy the man who thought he could strip away 8 years of distinguished service without consequence. Brennan had no idea that his moment of triumph was actually the beginning of his complete downfall. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez spent the morning after Chen's public humiliation creating what he privately called his insurance policy. Hidden in the supply room, where he managed inventory systems, Rodriguez opened a secure digital file that would document every instance of Brennan's abuse he could verify through official records. The previous day's badge removal had finally pushed him past the point of silent compliance into active resistance against institutional corruption. Rodriguez had maintained detailed logs of equipment discrepancies for months, initially thinking the irregularities represented clerical errors rather than deliberate theft. Now he understood that Brennan's financial crimes were connected to his abusive leadership style, both symptoms of someone who believed military rank placed him above accountability. The sergeant's methodical documentation would provide the foundation for criminal charges that extended far beyond harassment into federal territory. His first discovery shocked him despite months of suspicion. Military equipment worth over $400,000 had disappeared from Fort Meridian's inventory during Brennan's 18-month command, each item properly signed out, but never returned to storage. The pattern suggested systematic theft rather than accounting errors, with expensive communications gear and weapons accessories disappearing through falsified transfer orders that Brennan had personally authorized. Cross-referencing serial numbers with national databases revealed that several missing items had appeared at civilian gun shows across 3 states, sold through intermediaries who specialized in military surplus equipment. Rodriguez photographed every document with his personal device, understanding that this evidence could disappear if Brennan discovered his investigation. The sergeant was building a case that would interest federal prosecutors as much as military justice officials. Meanwhile, Chen used her public disgrace as cover for expanded investigation into Brennan's personal conduct beyond equipment theft. Her damaged reputation actually provided advantages, making witnesses more willing to share information with someone who'd experienced Brennan's abuse firsthand. What she learned through careful interviews painted a picture of systematic sexual harassment that had driven multiple female soldiers from military service entirely. Private Martinez provided the most detailed testimony during a supposedly routine logistics meeting in Chen's temporary office. The young soldier described how Brennan's uniform inspections often involved inappropriate physical contact, his hands lingering on female personnel while he examined ribbons and badges mounted on their chest areas. Martinez's account included specific dates and witnesses, creating a timeline of escalating inappropriate behavior that had been ignored by intermediate supervisors afraid to challenge Brennan's authority. The harassment extended beyond physical contact in a psychological warfare designed to drive female soldiers from military service. Chen documented a pattern where Brennan assigned impossible tasks to women who challenged his behavior, setting them up for failure that justified negative performance evaluations. 3 promising female NCOs had received career-ending efficiency reports after refusing to tolerate his inappropriate conduct during private counseling sessions. Lieutenant Vale's contribution to the investigation proved invaluable due to her access to personnel records and administrative systems Brennan thought were secure from scrutiny. Working late in the company office, Vale discovered that Brennan had been systematically altering performance evaluations for female soldiers who filed complaints against him. Her digital forensics skills revealed deleted text and modified ratings that had destroyed multiple military careers through fraudulent documentation. Vale's most significant discovery involved Brennan's manipulation of medical records related to training injuries. Several female soldiers had sustained suspicious injuries during his aggressive training exercises, but their medical reports had been altered to suggest the injuries occurred during off-duty activities. This systematic cover-up of training-related injuries represented criminal conspiracy that could result in federal prosecution for endangering military personnel. The 3 investigators coordinated their efforts through carefully planned meetings disguised as routine administrative functions. Chin's position provided overall strategic direction. Rodriguez supplied evidence of financial crimes, and Vale contributed personnel documentation that proved systematic discrimination. Together, they were building a comprehensive case that would expose the full scope of Brennan's criminal enterprise disguised as military leadership. Their covert cooperation faced immediate danger when Brennan began targeting Rodriguez for transfer to an undesirable assignment in Alaska. The colonel's retaliation was swift and obvious, designed to intimidate other potential witnesses while removing someone who had access to incriminating financial records. Rodriguez's impending transfer created urgency around preserving evidence that could disappear once he left Fort Meridian. Chin realized that her investigation had reached a critical point where Brennan's awareness of their activities threatened both evidence preservation and witness safety. His escalating retaliation suggested that he understood the scope of their documentation efforts and was prepared to use his command authority to silence opposition through intimidation and career destruction. The time for covert investigation was ending, replaced by urgent need for outside intervention. During their final coordinated meeting, the 3 investigators consolidated their evidence into encrypted files that would be transmitted to Pentagon authorities within hours. Rodriguez provided financial documentation proving systematic theft. Vale contributed personnel records showing discrimination and fraud, and Chin supplied testimony from multiple harassment victims who had been afraid to come forward until now. Their combined evidence represented grounds for criminal prosecution under multiple federal statutes. Chin's decision to reveal her true identity to her allies marked the investigation's transition from documentation to action phase. When she showed Rodriguez and Vale her Pentagon Inspector General credentials, their expressions shifted from surprise to determination as they understood that their evidence would reach the highest levels of military command. The colonel who had terrorized Fort Meridian for 18 months was about to face justice that would end his career and send him to federal prison. The encrypted transmission to Pentagon investigators that evening contained over 200 pages of evidence documenting systematic abuse, theft, sexual harassment, and fraudulent record-keeping that had flourished under Brennan's command. Chin's cover as a routine logistics officer was about to be blown, but the comprehensive evidence package would justify immediate intervention from military criminal investigators who specialized in corruption cases. As Rodriguez prepared for his forced transfer and Vale continued gathering last-minute documentation, Chin composed what she knew would be her final undercover report. Tomorrow would bring confrontation as Brennan discovered the scope of their investigation, but tonight belonged to 3 soldiers who had chosen justice over personal safety. Their courage would trigger institutional response that would restore Fort Meridian to the standards of excellence it had abandoned under corrupted leadership. The weight of evidence against Brennan was overwhelming, but Chin understood that powerful people often survive scandals that would destroy ordinary soldiers. Her investigation had provided ammunition for justice, but firing that ammunition would require courage from Pentagon officials willing to challenge institutional protection of senior officers. Time would determine whether evidence alone could overcome the bureaucratic inertia that had allowed Brennan's abuse to flourish for 18 months without meaningful consequences. Chen's secure communication with Pentagon Inspector General's office began at 0500 hours, her encrypted satellite phone connecting directly to General Patricia Morrison's crisis response team. The transmission of evidence files took 47 minutes, each document representing another nail in Brennan's professional coffin as federal investigators absorbed the scope of corruption that had flourished at Fort Meridian. Morrison's immediate response confirmed what Chen had suspected. This case would trigger the largest military justice investigation in recent Pentagon history. The general's questions were precise and urgent, focusing on witness safety and evidence preservation as much as criminal prosecution. Morrison understood that Brennan's retaliation against Rodriguez represented just the beginning of his attempt to silence opposition through intimidation and career destruction. Her authorization for immediate protective measures included orders that would supersede Brennan's command authority, though implementing those orders required careful timing to prevent evidence destruction. Rodriguez faced his first direct threat when Brennan summoned him for private counseling that morning, using the guise of performance evaluation to interrogate him about his recent activities. The colonel's questions probed around Rodriguez's access to supply records and his interactions with other personnel, fishing for information about potential investigation activities. Rodriguez maintained operational security while documenting every detail of Brennan's intimidation attempt for later prosecution. Brennan's threat was explicit despite careful phrasing designed to avoid actionable charges. He suggested that Rodriguez's upcoming transfer to Alaska could be modified to an even less desirable assignment if his attitude didn't improve, making it clear that cooperation with any investigation would result in career destruction. The colonel's confidence in his ability to manipulate personnel assignments revealed his continued belief that command authority provided immunity from accountability. Vale discovered the extent of Brennan's desperation when she arrived at work to find him personally searching through administrative files that contained evidence of his fraudulent record-keeping. His presence in the company office at 6 a.m, rifling through personnel folders with obvious panic, confirmed that he understood the scope of the investigation building against him. Vale's quick thinking preserved crucial documents by claiming they were needed for routine administrative review. The lieutenant's most shocking discovery came when she accessed Brennan's computer terminal while he was distracted with emergency calls to higher headquarters. His deleted email files contained correspondence with civilian contacts who specialized in military surplus sales, confirming Rodriguez's suspicions about systematic equipment theft. Vale's digital forensics training allowed her to recover communications that would provide federal prosecutors with evidence of conspiracy and interstate commerce violations. Chen realized that her investigation had entered its most dangerous phase when Brennan attempted to confine her to quarters for alleged insubordination related to the previous day's uniform violation. His emergency order restricting her movement represented a desperate attempt to prevent further evidence gathering, while he destroyed incriminating materials and intimidated witnesses into silence. The colonel's escalating panic suggested he understood that his criminal enterprise was collapsing despite his efforts at damage control. The confrontation that would end Chen's undercover mission began in Brennan's office at 1400 hours, when he summoned her for what he announced as formal disciplinary action. His confidence had returned as he prepared to destroy the officer who had threatened his authority through investigation activities he was only beginning to understand. Brennan had no idea that his intended victim carried credentials that would transform their meeting from disciplinary hearing into criminal confession. Chun allowed Brennan to incriminate himself thoroughly before revealing her true identity, documenting his explicit threats and abuse of authority while he believed himself safe from accountability. His detailed description of how he would destroy her military career provided perfect evidence of criminal retaliation against someone conducting legitimate investigation under federal authority. The colonel's arrogance became the foundation for federal charges that would send him to prison for decades. The moment of revelation came when Brennan ordered Chen's immediate transfer to a combat zone assignment designed to remove her from Fort Meridian before she could cause further problems. His abuse of personnel systems to punish someone for investigation activities represented federal crime that carried serious prison time, but he was too confident in his authority to recognize the legal trap he was creating for himself. Chen's patience in allowing him to commit additional crimes was about to pay enormous dividends. Chen's presentation of her Pentagon Inspector General credentials shocked Brennan into temporary silence as he processed the implications of everything he'd just confessed to a federal investigator. His face cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally desperate calculation as he understood that 18 months of criminal activity had been thoroughly documented by someone with direct access to the highest levels of military command. The colonel's world was collapsing in real time as he grasped the scope of his exposure. Brennan's immediate response was predictable and criminal, threatening Chun with court-martial for conducting unauthorized investigation while impersonating a logistics officer. His attempt to criminalize legitimate federal investigation represented obstruction of justice that would add years to his eventual prison sentence. But panic had replaced rational thinking as he faced the destruction of everything he'd built through corruption and abuse. Chen's activation of emergency protocols brought immediate response from Pentagon crisis management systems that had been waiting for her signal. General Morrison's authorization triggered deployment of Criminal Investigation Command personnel who were already en route to Fort Meridian with arrest warrants and evidence seizure orders. Brennan's threats against a federal investigator had just escalated his legal jeopardy from military discipline to federal prosecution under multiple statutes. The emergency message Chun transmitted to Pentagon headquarters was brief but comprehensive, confirming systematic criminal activity and requesting immediate intervention to protect witnesses and preserve evidence. Her 48-hour timeline for institutional response reflected the urgency of Brennan's escalating retaliation and his demonstrated willingness to destroy careers to protect his criminal enterprise. The colonel had perhaps hours before his authority would be permanently removed. Rodriguez and Vale received encrypted warnings about Brennan's desperation and instructions for evidence preservation that would ensure their documentation survived any destruction attempts. Their courage in gathering incriminating materials had provided foundation for federal prosecution, but their safety now depended on Pentagon intervention arriving before Brennan could complete his retaliation against witnesses who had dared to challenge his authority. As evening approached, Chun prepared for what she knew would be her final night undercover at Fort Meridian. Tomorrow would bring federal investigators with authority that superseded any colonel's command, but tonight belonged to a corrupt officer who still believed his rank provided immunity from accountability. The next 24 hours would determine whether justice prevailed or whether institutional protection would shield another criminal wearing military uniform. The weight of 18 months of systematic abuse hung over Fort Meridian like storm clouds as 3 investigators prepared for the confrontation that would either restore institutional integrity or demonstrate that corruption had become too entrenched for federal intervention to overcome. Chen's revelation had triggered responses that would test whether the military justice system could still distinguish between rank and righteousness when powerful people faced accountability for criminal behavior. General Patricia Morrison's emergency briefing at the Pentagon began at 0600 hours. Her crisis response team assembled around classified materials that detailed the most comprehensive military corruption case they'd encountered in recent years. The evidence from Fort Meridian filled 3 separate investigation categories, including criminal theft, sexual harassment, and obstruction of justice, requiring coordinated response from multiple federal agencies. Morrison's decision to deploy Criminal Investigation Command personnel reflected the seriousness of charges that could result in decades of federal prison time. Morrison assigned Colonel David Thompson to lead the CID response team, selecting him for both his investigative expertise and his reputation for prosecuting senior officers who believed rank provided immunity from accountability. Thompson's previous cases included 2 general officers and multiple colonels who had abused their authority for personal gain, making him ideal for confronting someone like Brennan, who had systematically corrupted his command for 18 months. The deployment order included forensic accountants, digital evidence specialists, and witness protection personnel who would preserve evidence while ensuring the safety of Rodriguez, Vail, and other Fort Meridian personnel who had risked their careers to document institutional corruption. Morrison understood that Brennan's desperation made him dangerous to anyone who could testify about his criminal activities, requiring federal intervention to prevent witness intimidation or worse. While Pentagon investigators prepared for deployment, Brennan launched his own desperate campaign to destroy evidence and silence witnesses before federal authority arrived at Fort Meridian. His first priority involved the financial records that Rodriguez had been documenting, leading him to personally oversee destruction of supply documents that detailed equipment theft over the previous 18 months. The colonel's panic drove him to criminal acts that would add obstruction charges to his eventual indictment. Brennan's attempt to eliminate digital evidence revealed both his criminal sophistication and his fundamental misunderstanding of modern forensic capabilities. He spent hours deleting files from administrative computers while believing that standard deletion would prevent federal investigators from recovering incriminating communications. His ignorance of data recovery techniques meant that every deleted email and document would be available to CID specialists within hours of their arrival. The colonel's most dangerous escalation involved direct threats against witnesses who had gathered evidence for Chen's investigation. Rodriguez received explicit warnings about the consequences of testifying against superior officers, with Brennan making it clear that cooperation with federal investigators would result in career destruction and criminal charges for theft of classified materials. The colonel's threats represented federal crimes that would extend his prison sentence beyond anything his original corruption could have generated. Vail faced similar intimidation when Brennan discovered her access to personnel files that documented his fraudulent performance evaluations. His private meeting with the lieutenant included explicit threats about the fate of officers who fabricated evidence against their commanding officers, suggesting that her cooperation with investigators would result in court-martial and dismissal from military service. Brennan's desperation had driven him to criminal retaliation that would add federal charges to his eventual prosecution. Chun coordinated witness protection from her quarters while maintaining communication with Pentagon investigators who were tracking Brennan's increasingly frantic attempts at damage control. Her real-time updates allowed federal authorities to document obstruction of justice as it occurred, building additional criminal charges while ensuring that key witnesses survived Brennan's retaliation attempts. The colonel's escalating panic was providing prosecutors with evidence of consciousness of guilt that would be invaluable during trial. Martinez emerged as the investigation's most vulnerable witness when Brennan learned about her detailed testimony regarding sexual harassment and inappropriate physical contact during uniform inspections. His retaliation was swift and brutal, involving emergency transfer orders that would remove her from Fort Meridian before federal investigators could arrive. Martinez's panic at facing career destruction for telling the truth highlighted the systemic intimidation that had protected Brennan's criminal behavior for 18 months. The base commander's discovery of federal investigation activities created additional complications as institutional loyalty conflicted with legal obligations to cooperate with Pentagon authorities. Colonel James Patterson had enabled Brennan's abuse through willful ignorance and active suppression of complaints, making him potentially complicit in criminal conspiracy. His attempts to minimize the situation while protecting his own career represented institutional corruption that extended beyond individual criminal behavior. Chen's emergency meeting with Patterson revealed the scope of command complicity in Brennan's criminal enterprise, with multiple officers aware of systematic abuse, but unwilling to risk their careers by challenging someone with political connections and aggressive retaliation tactics. Patterson's admission that he deliberately ignored evidence of misconduct provided federal prosecutors with testimony about institutional conspiracy that would support broader criminal charges. Thompson's advance team arrived at Fort Meridian that evening, their unmarked vehicles providing first indication that federal authority was displacing local command structure. The CD colonel's immediate meeting with Chun allowed him to assess witness safety while reviewing evidence that would support arrest warrants being prepared for service within hours. Thompson's reputation for prosecuting senior officers had preceded him, creating panic among personnel who had enabled Brennan's criminal activities. Rodriguez received word of federal arrival through secure channels that bypassed Brennan's command authority, allowing him to preserve crucial evidence while avoiding final retaliation attempts that could destroy careers or physical safety. The sergeant's relief was visible as he understood that 18 months of systematic intimidation were ending with outside intervention that would restore accountability to Fort Meridian's command structure. Vale's coordination with CID digital specialists ensured that Brennan's deleted files would be recovered and preserved for prosecution, while her administrative access provided federal investigators with real-time monitoring of the colonel's continued obstruction attempts. Her courage in gathering evidence, while facing explicit threats, had provided foundation for federal charges that would send multiple officers to prison for corruption and conspiracy. The 48-hour timeline Chun had established was approaching its conclusion as federal investigators consolidated evidence, while preparing for confrontation with a colonel who still believed his rank provided immunity from accountability. Brennan's criminal escalation during the investigation had transformed simple abuse of authority into federal conspiracy charges that carried decades in prison, but his desperation suggested he would continue fighting even after federal authority arrived. As midnight approached, 3 separate investigations were converging on Fort Meridian with the force of federal authority that would either restore institutional integrity or demonstrate that military corruption had become too entrenched for justice to overcome. Tomorrow would bring arrest warrants and evidence seizures that would test whether the military justice system could still hold senior officers accountable for criminal behavior disguised as legitimate command authority. Chin's final encrypted report to Pentagon authorities confirmed that systematic corruption at Fort Meridian extended beyond individual criminal behavior into institutional conspiracy that had protected abusers while destroying victims who dared to seek accountability. Federal intervention was no longer optional, but essential to prevent complete institutional collapse under the weight of corruption that had flourished for 18 months without meaningful opposition until 3 courageous soldiers decided that justice mattered more than personal safety. Colonel Thompson's CD team established their command post in Fort Meridian's conference room at 0700 hours, transforming the administrative space into a federal investigation center with digital forensics equipment and secure communication systems. Thompson's forensic accountants began their analysis by accessing supply databases that Brennan believed he had purged, discovering that federal backup systems had preserved every transaction and deletion attempt from the previous 18 months. The colonel's criminal enterprise was being reconstructed in real time through evidence he thought he had destroyed. Thompson's first priority involved recovering the financial records that Rodriguez had documented before Brennan's destruction attempts, using advanced data recovery techniques to resurrect deleted files from administrative computers. The forensic specialists worked methodically through storage systems, retrieving communications between Brennan and civilian contacts who had purchased stolen military equipment through intermediaries specializing in surplus sales. Each recovered email added federal conspiracy charges to the growing criminal case. The scope of Brennan's theft exceeded even Chin's investigation estimates, with forensic accounting revealing systematic equipment diversion worth over $2.3 million during his command tenure. Thompson's team traced serial numbers through federal databases, discovering that stolen communications, gear, and weapons accessories had been sold across 12 states through networks that specialized in military surplus fraud. The colonel's criminal enterprise had operated with sophisticated planning that indicated long-term conspiracy rather than opportunistic theft. Brennan's awareness of federal investigation triggered his most desperate gambit yet, a calculated attempt to frame Chun for the very crimes he had committed over 18 months. Working through the night while CID investigators analyzed his deleted files, Brennan planted stolen military equipment in Chen's quarters while preparing fabricated evidence that would support theft charges against the Pentagon investigator who had exposed his corruption. The colonel's frame attempt demonstrated both criminal sophistication and fundamental desperation as he understood that federal prosecution was inevitable without dramatic action to redirect blame. His selection of communications equipment that matched items missing from inventory showed careful planning, while his falsification of requisition documents indicated experience with fraudulent paperwork that had enabled his original crimes. Brennan was betting everything on one final deception that would destroy his primary antagonist. Thompson's digital specialist simultaneously uncovered the full extent of Brennan's record falsification, recovering deleted performance evaluations that revealed systematic destruction of military careers through fraudulent documentation. The forensic analysis showed that 23 female soldiers had received negative ratings after filing complaints about harassment or inappropriate conduct, creating a clear pattern of retaliation that violated multiple federal statutes. Each falsified evaluation represented additional criminal charges that would extend Brennan's eventual prison sentence. The recovered email communications revealed Brennan's personal involvement in every aspect of his criminal enterprise, from negotiating prices with civilian buyers to coordinating equipment transfer through falsified military orders. Thompson's team documented a sophisticated conspiracy that had generated substantial personal income while systematically weakening military readiness through theft of essential communications and weapon systems. The evidence painted Brennan as the central figure in organized criminal activity that had operated for 18 months. Chen's morning began with Brennan's emergency accusation that stolen equipment had been discovered in her quarters during routine inspection. His theatrical outrage, designed to convince base personnel that the Pentagon investigator was actually the criminal they had been seeking. His formal complaint to Base Commander Patterson alleged that Chun had used her logistics position to facilitate equipment theft while conducting fraudulent investigation to cover her own criminal activities. The emergency hearing that Brennan demanded provided him with platform to present fabricated evidence against Chun while deflecting attention from his own criminal exposure. His performance was masterful in its dishonesty, combining genuine military equipment with falsified documentation that appeared to prove Chen's involvement in systematic theft. Patterson's initial acceptance of Brennan's accusations demonstrated the institutional loyalty that had protected criminal behavior for 18 months. Thompson's intervention came at the precise moment when Brennan's frame attempt reached its climax. The CID colonel's arrival in the hearing room, accompanied by federal agents who carried arrest warrants and evidence seizure orders. Thompson's announcement that Chun was a Pentagon inspector general investigator operating under federal authority immediately transformed the proceedings from disciplinary hearing to federal crime scene. Brennan's shock was visible as his final gambit collapsed in real time. The forensic evidence that destroyed Brennan's frame attempt was devastating in its precision, with timestamp analysis proving that the equipment in Chen's quarters had been placed there during the previous night while she was under federal protection. Thompson's team had monitored base security systems throughout their investigation, creating electronic records that documented Brennan's movement and access to Chen's quarters during the time period when stolen equipment appeared. The colonel's desperation had driven him to commit additional federal crimes under electronic surveillance. Thompson's presentation of recovered evidence to Base Commander Patterson revealed the scope of institutional failure that had enabled Brennan's criminal enterprise to flourish without meaningful oversight. The CID colonel's detailed briefing included financial records showing systematic theft, personnel documents proving fraudulent evaluations, and communications evidence demonstrating conspiracy with civilian criminal networks. Patterson's horror at learning the true extent of corruption under his command was genuine, but came too late to prevent federal prosecution. Chen's vindication was complete when Thompson formally restored her Pentagon credentials while announcing federal charges against Brennan that included theft, conspiracy, fraud, retaliation against federal investigators, and obstruction of justice. The CID colonel's public acknowledgement of Chen's 18-month investigation provided official validation for her sacrifice in enduring public humiliation while gathering evidence that would send multiple officers to federal prison. Rodriguez and Vale received federal protection as material witnesses whose testimony would be essential for prosecution of criminal conspiracy that extended beyond Brennan to include base personnel who had enabled his activities through willful ignorance or active participation. Their courage in gathering evidence while facing explicit threats had provided foundation for federal charges that would restore accountability to military institutions that had abandoned their core values. The base commander's position became untenable when Thompson revealed that Patterson had deliberately suppressed evidence of criminal activity while enabling retaliation against personnel who had attempted to report misconduct through proper channels. His removal from command was immediate and public, sending clear message that institutional protection of criminal behavior would result in prosecution rather than promotion for officers who valued loyalty over legality. As evening approached, Thompson's investigation had reconstructed 18 months of systematic criminal activity while documenting ongoing obstruction attempts that had added federal charges to an already overwhelming case. Brennan's frame attempt against Chun represented the final act of desperation that had sealed his fate while providing prosecutors with evidence of consciousness of guilt that would be invaluable during trial proceedings. The transformation of Fort Meridian from criminal enterprise to federal crime scene was complete as CID investigators prepared for arrests that would remove corrupted leadership while beginning institutional rehabilitation under Pentagon oversight. Thompson's team had documented evidence supporting federal prosecution of multiple officers while ensuring that witnesses would survive to testify about criminal conspiracy that had operated under cover of military authority for 18 months. Chen's mission was approaching its conclusion as federal authority displaced local command structure that had protected criminal behavior while destroying careers of personnel who had dared to seek accountability through proper channels. Tomorrow would bring formal arrests and public acknowledgement that institutional corruption had been exposed through courage of 3 soldiers who had chosen justice over personal safety despite facing explicit threats and career destruction. The Pentagon convoy arrived at Fort Meridian's main gate at 0900 hours. 5 black vehicles carrying the senior military leadership that would formally end Brennan's criminal enterprise while restoring institutional accountability to a base that had lost its moral foundation. General Harrison led the delegation with 4 additional flag officers whose combined authority represented the highest levels of military command responding to systematic corruption that had operated for 18 months without meaningful opposition. The sight of 5 general officers arriving simultaneously sent shockwaves through Fort Meridian's personnel, who understood that such unprecedented display of senior leadership indicated institutional crisis requiring immediate intervention. Word spread rapidly through barracks and administrative buildings as soldiers recognized that their base had become the focus of Pentagon attention that would fundamentally transform command structure and operational procedures. Harrison's immediate meeting with Thompson confirmed that federal evidence supported criminal prosecution under multiple statutes while demonstrating institutional failure that extended beyond individual criminal behavior into systematic conspiracy. The CID colonel's briefing included financial records proving theft, personnel documents showing fraudulent evaluations, and communications evidence documenting retaliation against federal investigators that had escalated into attempted frame-up of Pentagon personnel. Brennan remained unaware of the approaching confrontation as he prepared for what he believed would be his vindication through Chen's arrest and prosecution for equipment theft. His confidence had returned following his frame attempt, believing that fabricated evidence would redirect federal investigation while destroying the Pentagon investigator who had threatened his criminal enterprise. The colonel had no idea that electronic surveillance had documented his crimes, while forensic analysis had demolished his deception. The formation assembly that would end Brennan's career began at 1100 hours, with 200 Fort Meridian personnel gathering on the parade ground where Chun had suffered public humiliation just days earlier. The massive formation created perfect audience for institutional justice that would demonstrate accountability could still reach senior officers who believed rank provided immunity from consequences. Every witness to Chen's badge removal would see Brennan's complete downfall. General Harrison's arrival on the parade ground with 4 additional flag officers created visible tension among personnel who had never witnessed such concentration of senior military leadership at Fort Meridian. The general's presence communicated institutional seriousness that transcended routine command changes or ceremonial visits, indicating that fundamental transformation was beginning through direct Pentagon intervention in local command structure. Brennan's approach to the formation demonstrated his continued belief that military rank would protect him from accountability, his bearing confident as he prepared to address what he assumed was routine administrative gathering. His shock became visible when he recognized Harrison's 4-star insignia and realized that Pentagon leadership had arrived to personally address systematic corruption that had flourished under his command authority. The colonel's final attempt at intimidation focused on Chun, who stood among the assembled officers with their Pentagon credentials, now publicly acknowledged through Thompson's investigation. Brennan's approach carried menace designed to reinforce his version of events while demonstrating continued authority over personnel who had dared to challenge his criminal behavior. His performance was calculated to convince witnesses that federal investigation represented persecution rather than legitimate prosecution. Harrison's intervention was immediate and devastating. The 4-star general stepping forward to present relief orders that formally ended Brennan's command while placing him under arrest for federal crimes documented through 18 months of systematic evidence gathering. The general's voice carried across the silent formation as he announced charges that included theft, conspiracy, fraud, sexual harassment, retaliation against federal investigators, and obstruction of justice. The public reading of criminal charges created stunned silence among 200 witnesses who had endured Brennan's abuse while believing that military rank placed him beyond accountability. Harrison's detailed recitation included financial evidence showing $2.3 million in stolen equipment, personnel records proving fraudulent evaluations designed to destroy military careers, and communications documenting conspiracy with civilian criminal networks that had operated across multiple states. Brennan's complete psychological collapse was visible as 18 months of criminal authority dissolved under Pentagon intervention that he had never believed possible. His attempted protests about federal overreach and investigative persecution rang hollow against Harrison's presentation of overwhelming evidence that documented systematic criminal behavior disguised as legitimate military leadership. The colonel's world was ending in front of every person he had terrorized. Chen's vindication came when Harrison personally restored her military decorations in full view of the formation that had witnessed her public humiliation. The 4-star general's ceremony reversing institutional injustice while demonstrating that courage in exposing corruption would be rewarded rather than punished. Her Bronze Star and Combat Action Ribbon were reattached to her uniform jacket with ceremony that honored her sacrifice in enduring abuse while gathering evidence for federal prosecution. The military police arrest that concluded Brennan's career was conducted with professional efficiency that contrasted sharply with his 18 months of theatrical abuse and intimidation. Federal agents placed handcuffs on the colonel while reading constitutional rights that highlighted his transition from military authority to federal defendant facing decades in prison for criminal conspiracy that had operated under cover of command responsibility. Rodriguez and Vale stood among witnesses to institutional justice that validated their courage in gathering evidence while facing explicit threats and career destruction. Their relief was visible as they understood that federal prosecution would proceed with testimony from Pentagon investigators rather than vulnerable subordinates who could face continued retaliation from institutional loyalists who valued rank protection over legal accountability. Harrison's address to the formation following Brennan's arrest emphasized institutional commitment to accountability while acknowledging systematic failure that had enabled criminal behavior to flourish without meaningful oversight. The general's speech promised comprehensive investigation of all Fort Meridian personnel who had participated in or enabled corruption while guaranteeing protection for witnesses who had risked everything to expose institutional decay. The transformation of Fort Meridian from criminal enterprise to rehabilitation center began immediately with Harrison's announcement that Pentagon oversight would continue until institutional integrity was restored through personnel changes and procedural reforms. The base would operate under direct federal supervision, while systematic investigation continued into conspiracy that had involved multiple officers and civilian contractors across several states. Martinez emerged from 18 months of fear and intimidation to receive public recognition for her courage in providing detailed testimony about sexual harassment and inappropriate conduct that had driven multiple female soldiers from military service. Her vindication demonstrated that institutional justice could still protect vulnerable personnel from senior officers who had abused their authority for personal gratification while destroying promising military careers. As the formation dispersed under Pentagon authority that had displaced local command structure, 200 witnesses carried understanding that systematic corruption had finally met institutional accountability through federal intervention that would restore Fort Meridian to standards of excellence it had abandoned under criminal leadership. The parade ground where Chun had been humiliated had become the site of complete vindication for everyone who had suffered under Brennan's systematic abuse. The 5 generals' presence at Fort Meridian represented institutional commitment to justice that transcended individual criminal prosecution to address systematic failure that had enabled corruption to flourish for 18 months. Their intervention marked the beginning of comprehensive reform that would restore military values while ensuring that future corruption would face immediate federal response rather than institutional protection for senior officers who believed rank provided immunity from accountability. Major Patterson's arrest came at 1400 hours the same day as Brennan's removal, federal agents executing warrants while he attempted to destroy additional evidence that linked him to systematic suppression of misconduct complaints over 18 months. Thompson's investigation had traced Patterson's complicity through digital communications, showing deliberate conspiracy to protect Brennan's criminal enterprise while retaliating against personnel who had attempted to report abuse through proper channels. His crimes included obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and accessory to theft of military property. The major's breakdown during interrogation revealed the scope of institutional corruption that had infected Fort Meridian's command structure at multiple levels, with Patterson providing detailed testimony about pressure from senior leadership to minimize complaints while protecting officers with political connections. His confession implicated 3 additional field-grade officers who had participated in evidence suppression while enabling systematic abuse that had destroyed dozens of military careers through fraudulent documentation and career sabotage. Thompson's expansion of criminal investigation beyond Brennan and Patterson demonstrated that corruption had metastasized throughout Fort Meridian's leadership structure, requiring comprehensive federal intervention to remove all compromised personnel while rebuilding institutional integrity from foundation level. The CID colonel's methodical approach ensured that every participant in criminal conspiracy would face federal prosecution rather than administrative discipline that had previously protected institutional corruption. Base Commander Colonel James Patterson received immediate relief from duty when Harrison's investigation revealed his willful blindness to systematic criminal activity that had operated under his direct command for 18 months. The colonel's removal was public and permanent, sending clear message that senior officers would face career destruction for enabling subordinate corruption through deliberate ignorance or active participation in institutional cover-up activities. Chen's promotion to major came with assignment to the Pentagon Inspector General's office, where her experience with institutional corruption would inform systematic reforms designed to prevent future criminal enterprises from operating under cover of military authority. Harrison personally presented her new rank insignia, while acknowledging that her courage in enduring public humiliation had provided foundation for federal prosecution that would restore accountability to military institutions nationwide. Rodriguez received promotion to Sergeant First Class, along with commendation for exceptional courage in gathering financial evidence that had exposed systematic theft worth over $2 million during Brennan's command tenure. His meticulous documentation of equipment irregularities had provided federal prosecutors with evidence that would ensure criminal conviction while demonstrating that enlisted personnel could successfully challenge senior officer corruption through proper investigative procedures. Vale's assignment as Chin's deputy in the new Military Training Oversight Division recognized her digital forensics expertise while ensuring that personnel who had risked everything to expose institutional corruption would continue serving in positions where their experience could prevent future criminal enterprises. Her recovery of deleted records had been instrumental in documenting systematic fraud while providing template for federal investigation of similar corruption at other military installations. Martinez received formal recognition for her courage in providing detailed testimony about sexual harassment that had driven multiple female soldiers from military service. Her willingness to face retaliation, enabling federal prosecution of systematic abuse that had operated for 18 months without meaningful institutional response. Her promotion to Staff Sergeant came with assignment to victim advocacy programs, where her experience would help other personnel report misconduct without fear of career destruction. The Pentagon's announcement of Military Justice Reform Initiative represented institutional acknowledgement that systematic corruption required comprehensive response beyond individual criminal prosecution, with new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent senior officers from abusing command authority while retaliating against subordinates who reported misconduct through proper channels. Harrison's leadership of reform effort demonstrated Pentagon commitment to fundamental transformation of military culture. Congressional inquiry into military training abuse began within 72 hours of Brennan's arrest, with Senate Armed Services Committee demanding comprehensive briefing about institutional failures that had enabled systematic criminal activity to operate without detection for 18 months. The legislative investigation would examine Pentagon oversight procedures while evaluating whether additional reforms were necessary to prevent future corruption from flourishing under inadequate supervision. Fort Meridian's placement under direct Pentagon oversight represented unprecedented federal intervention in local command structure, with Harrison's team assuming operational control, while systematic investigation continued into criminal conspiracy that had involved multiple officers and civilian contractors across several states. The base would operate under federal supervision until institutional integrity was restored through personnel replacement and procedural reform. The discovery of 347 additional misconduct cases during expanded investigation demonstrated that Brennan's criminal enterprise represented just the visible portion of institutional decay that had infected military training programs nationwide. Thompson's team would coordinate with CID investigators at 12 other installations where similar patterns suggested systematic corruption requiring federal intervention and criminal prosecution. Chin's testimony before Senate Armed Services Committee provided detailed account of institutional failures that had enabled systematic abuse while highlighting reforms necessary to prevent future corruption from operating under cover of military authority. Her presentation emphasized the courage required for subordinate personnel to challenge senior officers, while recommending whistleblower protections that would encourage reporting of misconduct without fear of career retaliation. The President's announcement of Military Culture Reform Initiative represented highest-level institutional commitment to addressing systematic problems that had been exposed through Chin's investigation, with executive branch authority supporting comprehensive transformation of military training programs while ensuring accountability reached all levels of command structure. Presidential involvement demonstrated that institutional corruption would face political consequences beyond criminal prosecution. Harrison's establishment of the Military Training Oversight Division created permanent institutional mechanism for preventing future corruption, while ensuring that personnel who reported misconduct would receive protection rather than retaliation from senior officers who valued institutional loyalty over legal accountability. The division's authority would extend across all military installations with mandate to investigate complaints that local commanders attempted to suppress. Rodriguez's assignment to train new investigators in evidence-gathering techniques would ensure that his experience with financial crimes could be applied systematically across military installations where similar corruption might be operating under cover of administrative complexity. His expertise in documenting equipment irregularities had provided template for exposing systematic theft that could be replicated at other bases with suspicious inventory patterns. Vail's development of digital forensics protocols would standardize evidence recovery procedures while ensuring that deleted records could be retrieved during federal investigations of institutional corruption. Her technical expertise had been crucial in documenting systematic fraud while providing model for future investigations that would face similar attempts at evidence destruction by desperate criminals wearing military uniform. The transformation of Fort Meridian from criminal enterprise to rehabilitation center continued under Pentagon supervision that would remain in place until institutional integrity was completely restored through personnel replacement and cultural reform. Harrison's comprehensive approach ensured that systematic corruption would be eliminated rather than simply transferred to different personnel who might continue criminal activities under improved concealment methods. As evening approached, the scope of institutional change triggered by Chen's investigation had expanded beyond individual criminal prosecution to encompass comprehensive reform of military training programs nationwide. Her courage in enduring public humiliation while gathering evidence had initiated federal response that would restore accountability to institutions that had lost their moral foundation through systematic corruption disguised as legitimate military authority. The immediate consequences of federal intervention demonstrated that institutional corruption could still be overcome through courage of individual personnel who chose justice over personal safety. But the scope of reform required indicated that systematic problems had infected military culture at levels that demanded comprehensive transformation rather than isolated criminal prosecution of obviously criminal behavior. The Senate Armed Services Committee hearing room filled to capacity as Chairman Senator Patricia Williams called the emergency session to order. Cameras broadcasting Chen's testimony live to military installations worldwide, where personnel watched their colleague describe 18 months of systematic abuse that had operated under institutional protection. Chen's appearance before Congress represented unprecedented acknowledgement that military corruption required legislative intervention beyond traditional Pentagon oversight mechanisms. Senator Williams' opening statement emphasized that Chen's case had exposed institutional failures, requiring comprehensive reform rather than isolated criminal prosecution, with legislative authority supporting systematic transformation of military training programs while ensuring accountability reached all levels of command structure. The committee's bipartisan support for reform demonstrated political consensus that institutional corruption threatened military effectiveness and required immediate congressional response. Chen's detailed testimony provided Congress with comprehensive account of Brennan's criminal enterprise while highlighting systematic failures that had enabled abuse to flourish for 18 months without meaningful institutional response. Her presentation emphasized the courage required for subordinate personnel to challenge senior officers, while documenting retaliation mechanisms that had protected corruption through intimidation and career destruction of witnesses who attempted to report misconduct. The legislative hearing revealed that Fort Meridian represented just one installation where systematic corruption had operated under cover of military authority, with committee investigators documenting similar patterns at 17 additional bases where senior officers had abused command authority while institutional oversight mechanisms had failed to detect or prevent criminal behavior. Chin's case had become catalyst for exposing nationwide problems requiring comprehensive federal intervention. Senator James Morrison's questioning focused on institutional mechanisms that had enabled Brennan's retaliation against witnesses, while protecting his criminal enterprise from accountability through suppression of complaints and falsification of performance evaluations. Chin's responses detailed how systematic intimidation had operated through official channels, while appearing to comply with military justice procedures that actually facilitated abuse rather than preventing it. Thompson's testimony following Chin's appearance provided Congress with forensic evidence documenting the scope of criminal conspiracy that had extended beyond individual misconduct into institutional failure, involving multiple command levels and civilian contractors. His presentation included financial records showing systematic theft, communications evidence proving conspiracy, and personnel documents demonstrating fraudulent evaluations designed to destroy military careers of anyone who challenged corruption. The committee's discovery that Brennan's criminal network had operated across 12 states while generating over $4 million in stolen military equipment shocked legislators who had underestimated the scope of institutional decay that had infected military supply systems. Thompson's evidence demonstrated that corruption had reached levels requiring federal law enforcement intervention beyond traditional military justice mechanisms. New regulations implemented across all military training facilities within 30 days of congressional hearings established mandatory reporting procedures for misconduct complaints while creating independent oversight mechanisms that bypassed local command authority. The regulations included whistleblower protections designed to prevent retaliation against personnel who reported abuse while ensuring that complaints would receive federal investigation rather than institutional suppression. Brennan's sentencing to 15 years in federal prison plus dismissal from military service provided public demonstration that senior officers would face serious consequences for systematic abuse of authority while sending clear message to other potential criminals that rank would not protect them from accountability. His complete financial forfeiture ensured that stolen equipment proceeds would be returned to military rather than enriching the criminal who had betrayed his oath of service. Chin's appointment to lead the new Military Training Oversight Division created permanent institutional position with authority to investigate misconduct complaints across all military installations while ensuring that local commanders could not suppress evidence or retaliate against witnesses. Her division would operate under direct Pentagon authority with mandate to bypass traditional command structure that had enabled systematic corruption. The President's Rose Garden ceremony, recognizing Chin's courage, provided highest-level institutional acknowledgement that exposing corruption served national security interests while encouraging other personnel to report misconduct without fear of career retaliation. Presidential involvement demonstrated executive branch commitment to military reform while highlighting individual courage that had triggered systematic institutional change. Rodriguez's promotion to the Military Training Oversight Division created permanent position where his expertise in financial crimes could be applied systematically across military installations to detect equipment theft and fraudulent transactions. His experience with Brennan's criminal enterprise provided template for identifying similar corruption patterns while ensuring that future investigations would benefit from proven investigative techniques. Vale's assignment as Regional Coordinator for Digital Forensics established her as lead specialist in recovering evidence from attempts at electronic destruction while training other investigators in techniques that had proven successful during Brennan's prosecution. Her protocols for data recovery would become standard procedure for federal investigations into military corruption involving systematic record falsification. The discovery of additional criminal networks operating at other military installations vindicated Chin's assertion that Fort Meridian represented systemic problem rather than isolated incident, with congressional investigation documenting corruption patterns that suggested coordinated criminal activity extending beyond individual command failures. Federal prosecutors prepared cases against 37 officers whose criminal behavior had been exposed through expanded investigation. Martinez's assignment to victim advocacy programs ensured that her experience with harassment and intimidation would inform support services for personnel who faced retaliation for reporting misconduct. Her work would focus on creating safe reporting mechanisms while providing protection for witnesses whose testimony was essential for successful prosecution of institutional corruption. Harrison's establishment of rapid response teams for investigating misconduct complaints created mechanism for immediate federal intervention when local commanders attempted to suppress evidence or retaliate against witnesses. The teams would deploy within 24 hours of receiving credible allegations, while ensuring that evidence preservation and witness protection would prevent destruction of criminal evidence. Congressional legislation strengthening military justice procedures passed both houses with overwhelming bipartisan support, creating permanent oversight mechanisms while establishing federal penalties for retaliation against personnel who reported misconduct through proper channels. The legislation included funding for expanded CID capabilities while mandating annual reviews of command climate at all military installations. Chen's address to Joint Session of Congress provided comprehensive assessment of institutional failures that had enabled systematic corruption while presenting recommendations for reform that would prevent future criminal enterprises from operating under cover of military authority. Her presentation emphasized that individual courage could still overcome institutional corruption when proper oversight mechanisms existed to protect witnesses and ensure accountability. The transformation of military training programs nationwide began with implementation of Chen's recommendations for oversight while establishing independent reporting mechanisms that bypassed local command authority. Her experience at Fort Meridian provided blueprint for reform that would restore institutional integrity while ensuring that future corruption would face immediate federal response rather than institutional protection. Thompson's assignment as director of the new Criminal Investigation Coordination Center created permanent federal capability for investigating multi-installation corruption while ensuring that evidence from different bases could be combined to expose criminal networks that operated across traditional command boundaries. His expertise with complex financial crimes would inform systematic investigation of military corruption nationwide. As congressional hearings concluded, the scope of institutional change triggered by Chen's courage had expanded beyond criminal prosecution to encompass comprehensive transformation of military culture that would restore accountability while protecting personnel who chose justice over institutional loyalty. Her sacrifice in enduring public humiliation had initiated federal response that would prevent future Brennans from abusing military authority while destroying careers of subordinates who dare to seek accountability. The national attention focused on military reform demonstrated that institutional corruption could still be overcome through individual courage combined with proper oversight mechanisms. But the scope of change required indicated that systematic problems had infected military culture at levels demanding permanent vigilance rather than episodic intervention when criminal behavior became too obvious to ignore. 6 months after Brennan's arrest, Chen returned to Fort Meridian to witness the transformation her investigation had triggered throughout the installation's command structure and operational procedures. The base that had once operated as criminal enterprise under systematic corruption now functioned with institutional integrity restored through comprehensive personnel changes and federal oversight. Walking across the parade ground where she had endured public humiliation, Chen reflected on the journey from victim to catalyst for nationwide military reform. Rodriguez greeted her outside the supply building, where his investigation had first documented equipment theft that would eventually expose criminal conspiracy worth over $4 million. His promotion to Sergeant First Class had come with assignment to train federal investigators in financial crime detection, ensuring that his expertise would prevent similar corruption from operating undetected at other military installations. Their reunion highlighted how courage in challenging authority had transformed both their careers and military culture nationwide. The conversation with Rodriguez revealed the scope of ongoing investigations that had expanded beyond Fort Meridian to expose criminal networks operating across multiple installations, with federal prosecutors preparing cases against dozens of officers whose abuse had flourished under inadequate oversight. His work with the Military Training Oversight Division had identified corruption patterns that suggested systematic problems requiring permanent vigilance rather than episodic intervention when criminal behavior became obvious. Vale's assignment as Chen's deputy had evolved into regional coordinator for digital forensics. Her technical expertise, now standardized across all military installations, where systematic record falsification had been used to conceal misconduct and enable retaliation against witnesses. Their professional partnership demonstrated how the investigation's success had depended on collaborative effort rather than individual heroism, with each team member's unique skills contributing to comprehensive documentation of institutional failure. The memorial service for victims of military training abuse took place in the same chapel where Brennan had once delivered sermons about military excellence while systematically destroying careers of subordinates who challenged his authority. Chen's participation in the ceremony honored 23 personnel whose military service had ended through fraudulent performance evaluations and systematic retaliation for reporting misconduct through proper channels. Martinez's presence at the memorial service represented triumph over institutional intimidation that had previously silenced victims through fear of career destruction and criminal prosecution. Her assignment to victim advocacy programs ensured that future personnel would receive support rather than retaliation for reporting abuse, while her testimony in congressional hearings had provided foundation for legislative reforms that strengthened whistleblower protections across all federal agencies. Secretary of Defense Richardson's presentation of the Distinguished Service Medal to Chun provided formal recognition that her sacrifice in enduring public humiliation had served national security interests while triggering institutional reforms that restored military effectiveness through accountability. The ceremony took place before assembled personnel who understood that individual courage could still overcome systematic corruption when proper oversight mechanisms existed to protect witnesses. Chen's private moment of reflection occurred in her former quarters, where Brennan had planted stolen equipment during his desperate attempt to frame her for the crimes he had committed over 18 months. The room that had once represented vulnerability to institutional retaliation now symbolized vindication through federal justice that had reached the highest levels of criminal conspiracy while protecting witnesses who had risked everything to expose corruption. The conversation with Base Commander Colonel Sarah Thompson, Rodriguez's former supervisor who had replaced the corrupted leadership structure, revealed how comprehensive personnel changes had restored institutional integrity while implementing oversight mechanisms that would prevent future corruption from operating under cover of military authority. Thompson's leadership represented a new generation of officers committed to accountability rather than protection of institutional loyalty above legal obligation. Chen's review of investigation outcomes demonstrated that federal prosecution had achieved justice beyond individual criminal conviction, with systematic reforms ensuring that future misconduct would face immediate federal response rather than institutional suppression through intimidation and career destruction. The 37 officers facing federal charges represented comprehensive accountability that had reached all levels of command structure involved in enabling systematic abuse. Rodriguez's family dinner invitation provided personal glimpse into how professional courage had strengthened rather than damaged relationships with personnel who valued integrity over institutional loyalty. His wife's gratitude for Chen's investigation acknowledged that systematic corruption had threatened military families through destruction of careers and financial security for anyone who challenged abusive authority. Vale's presentation of digital evidence protocols that would become standard procedure for federal investigations demonstrated how technical expertise developed during Brennan's prosecution had created permanent capability for exposing corruption involving systematic record falsification. Her work ensured that future criminals would face forensic techniques capable of recovering deleted evidence while documenting obstruction attempts. Do you think you'd have the courage to stand up to corruption like Chun did, even knowing the personal cost it might require? What experiences in your own life have tested your willingness to do what's right despite potential consequences? Chin's final meeting with Thompson focused on ongoing challenges in military culture reform, acknowledging that institutional change required sustained effort rather than dramatic intervention when corruption became undeniable. Their discussion emphasized that accountability mechanisms needed permanent implementation to prevent systematic abuse from flourishing under inadequate oversight that had enabled criminal behavior for 18 months. The Distinguished Service Medal ceremony concluded with Chin's commitment to continued service in positions where her experience with institutional corruption would inform systematic reforms designed to protect military personnel while ensuring accountability reached all levels of command structure. Her assignment to lead Federal Oversight Division represented recognition that individual courage could still overcome systematic corruption when combined with proper institutional support. 1 year after Brennan's arrest, Fort Meridian stood as testament to institutional transformation through accountability, its training programs now serving as model for military installations nationwide, where systematic reforms had eliminated corruption while restoring excellence through legitimate leadership. The parade ground where Chun had been publicly humiliated had been renamed Integrity Square, honoring the courage required to challenge authority when institutional loyalty conflicted with legal obligation and moral duty. Colonel Sarah Thompson's leadership had transformed Fort Meridian from criminal enterprise into exemplary training facility, with personnel surveys indicating complete restoration of trust in command structure that now prioritized accountability over protection of senior officers who abused their authority. Her implementation of oversight mechanisms had prevented 23 potential misconduct cases during the previous 6 months, demonstrating that proactive intervention could eliminate systematic abuse before it flourished under inadequate supervision. Chin's Military Training Oversight Division had expanded beyond individual installation monitoring into comprehensive federal capability for detecting and preventing corruption across all military training facilities, with her team's interventions resulting in criminal prosecution of 47 officers whose abuse had operated under institutional protection. Her promotion to lieutenant colonel recognized both her investigative expertise and leadership ability in managing complex federal operations that required coordination between military and civilian law enforcement agencies. Rodriguez's success in training federal investigators had created standardized protocols for financial crime detection that were being implemented across all military installations where equipment theft and fraudulent transactions had previously operated without detection. His expertise with Brennan's criminal methods had provided template for identifying similar corruption patterns while ensuring that future investigations would benefit from proven techniques for exposing systematic theft through forensic analysis. Vail's digital forensics protocols had become mandatory training for all CID investigators, with their techniques for evidence recovery preventing attempted destruction of criminal records in 12 separate cases involving senior officers who believed deleted files would protect them from accountability. Her technical innovations had closed loopholes that had previously allowed criminals to escape prosecution through electronic evidence destruction during federal investigations. The congressional legislation inspired by Chin's testimony had strengthened military justice procedures while creating permanent oversight mechanisms that ensured accountability would reach all levels of command structure involved in misconduct or its concealment. The law's whistleblower protections had encouraged reporting of systematic problems that might otherwise have remained hidden until criminal behavior became undeniable through external investigation. Martinez's victim advocacy programs had provided support for over 300 military personnel who had faced retaliation for reporting misconduct, with her experience informing comprehensive reforms that protected witnesses while ensuring their testimony could support successful criminal prosecution. Her work had demonstrated that institutional change required both accountability for criminals and protection for personnel who chose justice over institutional loyalty despite personal risk. The federal prison where Brennan served his 15-year sentence had become symbol of accountability that reached senior officers who had believed rank provided immunity from consequences for systematic criminal behavior. His complete loss of military benefits and retirement privileges demonstrated that corruption would result in total career destruction rather than administrative discipline that had previously protected institutional criminals from meaningful punishment. Prison interviews with Brennan revealed the psychology of institutional corruption that had enabled his criminal enterprise to operate for 18 months. With his continued belief that victims had deserved abuse, providing insight into mindset that justified systematic destruction of military careers through fraudulent evaluations and deliberate retaliation. His lack of remorse confirmed that federal prosecution had been necessary to protect future personnel from similar abuse. Chen's address to new Inspector General trainees emphasized that individual courage remained essential for exposing institutional corruption, but systematic reforms had created support mechanisms that would protect witnesses while ensuring accountability reached all levels of command structure involved in misconduct. Her presentation highlighted how collective action by Rodriguez, Vale, and Martinez had been crucial for comprehensive documentation that supported federal prosecution. The transformation of military culture nationwide demonstrated that Chen's sacrifice had achieved lasting institutional change beyond individual criminal prosecution, with accountability mechanisms now standard across all installations where systematic abuse had previously operated under inadequate oversight. Her investigation had triggered comprehensive reform that restored military effectiveness through elimination of corruption that had weakened national security while destroying personnel careers. Thompson's coordination with Chen's Oversight Division had created model for civil-military cooperation in preventing institutional corruption while maintaining command authority necessary for military effectiveness. Their partnership demonstrated that accountability and operational efficiency were complementary rather than conflicting goals when proper oversight mechanisms existed to detect abuse before it became systematic criminal enterprise. The annual ceremony honoring victims of military training abuse took place in Washington, where congressional leaders acknowledged that legislative reform had been necessary to address institutional failures that had enabled systematic corruption. The ceremony recognized 23 personnel whose careers had been destroyed through Brennan's retaliation while demonstrating that their sacrifice had achieved lasting protection for future military personnel. Rodriguez's family celebration of his promotion to Master Sergeant reflected personal vindication for courage in challenging authority when institutional loyalty conflicted with legal obligation, with his success demonstrating that accountability mechanisms could protect rather than punish personnel who reported misconduct through proper channels. His continued service in oversight positions ensured that technical expertise would prevent similar corruption from operating undetected. Vale's assignment to Pentagon headquarters provided her with platform for implementing digital security protocols that would prevent future attempts at evidence destruction during federal investigations into military corruption. Her technical innovations had created permanent capability for exposing systematic record falsification while ensuring that criminal prosecution would proceed despite obstruction attempts by desperate defendants. As Chun concluded her first year leading federal oversight operations, the scope of institutional change triggered by her investigation continued expanding through systematic implementation of accountability mechanisms that protected military personnel while ensuring that corruption would face immediate federal response rather than institutional concealment. Her courage in enduring public humiliation had initiated transformation that restored military culture to standards of excellence that honored rather than betrayed the oath of service. The legacy of Integrity Square served as permanent reminder that individual courage could still overcome systematic corruption when combined with proper institutional support, while Chen's ongoing leadership ensured that future personnel would inherit military culture committed to accountability rather than protection of criminal behavior disguised as legitimate authority. Her sacrifice had achieved lasting change that honored the service of all military personnel who chose justice over institutional loyalty despite personal risk.